Welcome to Tanfield Talks, and I'm going to be speaking about reform of the leasehold system today. The Government and the Law Commission have been very busy over the last few years, beavering away, trying to come up with some solutions to solve some of the current unfair practices in the leasehold sector, and to make England's 4.3 million leaseholders feel rather more safe in their own homes. When I planned this seminar some weeks ago, I was planning to talk about the proposals in the various consultation papers that had been published by the Law Commission, blissfully unaware that today was going to be the day that the Law Commission published not one but three final reports in relation to the matters on which it has been consulting. Those reports came out at 1 minute past midnight, so I feel rather like Laura Koonsberg with the withdrawal agreement, having to sort of cobble it together in order to give you some views on what is being proposed. I don't pretend that I have read all 1,882 pages of those reports, but hopefully I can provide a brief overview of the various proposals which the Law Commission has made. As you'll all know, in the last few years, there's been an increasing dissatisfaction with leasehold law, which has been brought into sharp focus by the so-called leasehold scandal, whereby there's been a prevalence for granting long leases at high or escalating ground rents, whereby the ground rent, for example, doubles every 10 years, which then makes it terribly expensive to enfranchise, and also can mean that the leaseholder ends up paying a very high rent. And that has brought into focus some of the other problems that there are with leasehold. So what's wrong with leasehold? Well, where does one start? There are a lot of issues that arise, some of which are really just results of being a homeowner in a situation where you don't have full control over the whole building. But some of the key elements of leasehold that cause problems is that, by definition, a lease, which is a term of years, is a wasting asset, so it runs out. Another problem is that there's a dual ownership, with the tenant owning the lease for a term of years, but somebody else being in control of what happens to the rest of the building. So there's a feeling that there's a lack of control. There's also the problem that even though you might have spent hundreds of thousands on a flat, you're still technically a tenant. And in addition, in order to try and combat some of these problems, there has been a lot of well-meaning legislation enacted over the years to try and solve some of the problems, but it's become rather entangled and complex. So some of the specific problems that have arisen with leasehold in recent years is, as I say, high ground rents being imposed on many leases. This isn't a matter that's particularly prevalent in London, but a lot of the new developments up north, this seems to be the fashion, to create these doubling ground rents. Another fashion has been to grant leases of houses. Houses are often on an estate, so there may be some sort of communal parts like gardens and driveways and what have you, but it isn't really necessary to grant a lease of a house, because you're not relying on anybody else to, for example, hold the house up. There's also an absence of compulsory regulation of managing agents, and a concern over excessive service charges and fees for permissions. So say, for example, the tenant wants to carry out alterations to the flat, landlords often charge large fees for deciding whether they will agree to that. And of course, there's always the risk of forfeiture if the tenant fails to abide by all the rules in the lease, and that can mean the removal of the tenant's asset altogether, which may be out of all proportion to whatever the breach of the lease was. So what's the solution? Well, this is the question which the Law Commission has been looking into. It hasn't looked at every aspect of leasehold law. That would be a very large subject, but it is concentrated on three particular elements of possible reform, namely getting rid of leasehold altogether and replacing it with Commonhold. Secondly, improving the rights of tenants to enfranchise, to get a lease extension, or to collectively enfranchise the whole building by compulsory acquiring the freehold. And thirdly, the Law Commission has looked at right to manage, which is an alternative to enfranchising if the leaseholders perhaps can't afford to actually buy the block, but want to take control of the management of it. So the first solution, the one probably most popular with leasehold activists, is to get rid of leasehold altogether and adopt a new system of Commonhold, which is a system which is used in many countries abroad. Unfortunately, it hasn't been used here, so it would create, in effect, a two systems in one country. So the Law Commission published a consultation paper on the subject of reinvigorating Commonhold, the alternative to leasehold ownership, back in December 2018, and its final report was produced today at 1 minute past midnight. And it's called Reinvigorating Commonhold because, of course, we already have Commonhold, but it hasn't exactly taken off. So the key features of Commonhold, which differs from leasehold, is that the owner of the flat or the unit, depending on whether it's residential or not, owns his unit outright. And for the purposes of Commonhold, the nomenclature is that what we would otherwise call a leaseholder is called a unit holder. So by owning the flat outright, of course, ownership doesn't run out. You don't have a landlord, and in theory, you're in control of what happens to your flat and to the building which contains your flat. And the way that Commonhold works is that instead of there being a landlord who owns the common parts and the grounds and what have you are owned by a Commonhold association. And the Commonhold association is a company in which each of the unit holders has a share. So that should, in theory, give them some control over what happens in the block. Instead of having a lease, or in the case of many blocks, a number of different types of lease, each unit holder signs up to a single Commonhold Community statement, which is partly prescribed by statute and partly contains local rules which the particular Commonhold association has decided to include. There's no right of forfeiture, no rent, and the Commonhold association can be democratically run. So you might think a certain number of similarities to the scenario where you have a 999-year lease and that the freehold is owned by a lessee-owned company in which each tenant has a share. Commonhold has in fact been around since 2004, but at the last count, I think there was fewer than 20 of them. So in a space of 16 years, they haven't proved terribly popular. In order to convert to becoming a Commonhold block, the current legislation requires 100% of the leaseholders and the freeholder and all their mortgagees to agree to the conversion to Commonhold. And in practice, of course, that is almost impossible to do. There's also little incentive for developers to set up new Commonholds rather than setting up the traditional leasehold developments, because there's no income stream for the developer after the Commonhold has been set up and transferred, and it restricts what they can do with the rest of the estate because there's restrictions on development. And I think there's also, of course, fear of the unknown, because people don't necessarily know what Commonhold is. So I think it's safe to say that the current system doesn't really work, and the Law Commission has made 121 recommendations for reform of the current Commonhold system. And you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to tell you about all of them. So the first problem is, how do you convert to Commonhold? As I said, under the original system, there had to be 100% consensus to convert, which in practice meant that lessees would have to enfranchise first, i.e. buy the freehold, and then once they've got the freehold, they would then have to get every single person in the block to agree to convert to a Commonhold. So what's proposed is that instead of having that two-stage approach, there should now be a streamlined system called collective freehold acquisition, whereby you acquire and convert in one swift movement. And instead of requiring all of the lessees to agree to that, it is proposed that it would only be necessary for 50% of the leaseholders to bring the collective freehold acquisition claim. So that's all fine and dandy, but what about all the leaseholders, the 49%, whatever it is, that don't consent to converting to the collective freehold acquisition and don't want to pay for the privilege of doing so? Well, that raises a bit of a problem for the Law Commission, and it's a similar problem that exists in collective enfranchisement, in that you either have to have the first option on that slide, which is that the people that don't consent to the conversion keep their leases with some statutory modification to make them compatible with the Commonhold model, but essentially they bought a lease and they should be entitled to retain a lease. Well, the problem with that is that you end up with, first of all, you end up with a two-tier system, and secondly, the Commonhold Association would be obliged to comply with the terms of the lease. It would in effect become the landlord of those leases, and would have to therefore manage the block in accordance with the obligations under the leases, even though it might want to manage it in a different way pursuant to the Commonhold statement. So that's the first option. The second option would be to require all non-consenting leaseholders to convert to Commonhold, whether they liked it or not. And again, the difficulty with that is that obviously their units have a value, and there's a question mark over who is going to pay for that cost of converting, and whether or not those leaseholders should be allowed to take advantage of the windfall that they'll get by replacing their perhaps short lease with effectively a freehold interest in their unit. So that was a dilemma for the Law Commission. The solution that they have come up with rather depends on whether the government is prepared to go along with the plan, the Law Commission would like to adopt option 2 and suggest that the way of funding the acquisition on the behalf of the non-consenting leaseholders would be for the government to provide equity loans to non-consenting leaseholders to cover their share of purchasing the freehold. There would then be a charge on the unit of the non-consenting leaseholder, and that would be repayable in due course, perhaps when they sold the flat. However, if the government isn't prepared to do that, then the alternative is to go back to option 1. But it does seem to me that that rather leaves quite a bit of the residual problem, that part of the block would be leasehold and part of the block would be commonhold. So there are obvious problems with converting an existing leasehold block into a commonhold block. But what about setting up a commonhold from scratch? I mean, that would obviously be easier to do, but again, it doesn't seem to have proved terribly attractive. Some of the recommendations which the Law Commission have made address the practicality of the modern day estate, because a lot of estates now are not just simply a block of flats. They may be a block of flats with a gym or shops or other commercial parts that need to be let out, or nursery schools or whatever. And one of the proposals is that rather than having a sort of one-size-fits-all commonhold scheme, it should be possible to divide blocks into sections. Not physically divide, but legally divide, to ensure that owners with a particular section are able to vote on matters affecting only that section. So, for example, all the retail units could vote on matters that affected retail units, and they could only have to pay for the services that benefit those retail units. So, for example, if there was a lift in the block that didn't benefit the shops, then perhaps they wouldn't need to pay for them. Another suggestion is that the development rights of the original developer could perhaps be reserved, so that there isn't that disincentive to the developer in creating a commonhold unit, because he can continue to develop the fourth block or whatever it is in the grounds, even though the other 3 blocks have been converted to commonhold, set up as commonhold. So what about from the point of view of the common holder or the unit holder? How does it actually affect them? What would be the difference between being a unit holder in a commonhold and a leaseholder in a leasehold block? Well, as I said earlier, the owners wouldn't have a lease as such, but they would all have to sign up to a Commonhold Community statement, and that would provide for the sorts of things you get in modern leases, in particular a reserve fund, insurance, a requirement that the Commonhold Association maintains the building, and it would also include rules which are necessary to promote communal living. Some of those rules would be prescribed, but some of them might be local rules which the Commonhold Community decides to impose. So that would be the kind of regulations that you often see in a lease, perhaps not keeping pets or not paying loud instruments after 11 o'clock or whatever. Under the current Commonhold legislation, it's relatively easy to change those local rules by a majority of the unit holders voting in favour of an amendment. But it's easy to see how that could be abused and how it could also put off potential purchases, because if you buy a unit with one set of rules, you do it on the basis that that's how it is going to continue. So to take my example of the pets, if you buy a flat which allows dogs, and then the residents get together and decide they don't really like dogs, you might be rather upset if a majority could vote in favour of a no dog policy. So the new rules, if enacted, will allow for amendments only if 75% of those turning up to vote support the decision. And in addition, there will be built-in protections for the minority interests who can apply to the FTT to have those protections upheld. It's also proposed that the owners within the block will be able to vote on the Commonhold budget. So in relation to the expenditure for the year on the block. And again, there'll be certain safeguards in place so that if the budget is going to go over a certain figure, then an application can be made to the FTT to see whether that is a fair increase. So that all sounds great, but I think the main argument that leaseholders have is that their service charges are too high, and all too often one finds that when leaseholders enfranchise, the service charges quite often go up because they actually want to carry out all the works which the landlord had failed to do. So under the Commonhold Community statement, the unit holders will be required to pay contributions to the shared costs, or service charges as we call them in leasehold, and also a contribution to a reserve fund. But what happens if somebody fails to pay their contribution? Well, the Commonhold Association can actually apply for the sale of the defaulting owner's unit in order to recover the arrears. However, there will be limits on that. First of all, it won't be able to apply for the sale if the arrears are less than £1,000. The arrears, it will be allowed to apply if the arrears have been outstanding for more than a year, but the FTT will have a discretion as to whether or not it's reasonable or proportionate to make an order. So in essence, that sounds remarkably similar to forfeiture, but of course the difference on forfeiture is that the whole value of the flat disappears, whereas the proposals in relation to Commonhold are that the surplus will be paid back to the unit holder once the arrears have been paid off. One slightly strange suggestion is that the arrears will be paid to the Commonhold Association ahead of secured creditors. Well, in times of sort of ever increasing house prices and arrears where there are sort of £1,000 or so, that sounds very sensible. But if, for example, a unit holder had a huge contribution to pay in relation to, let's say, defective cladding, and I don't think we can necessarily assume that house prices are going to go up indefinitely. It may well be that secured creditors wouldn't be too thrilled about the idea of their charge being postponed to the payment of contributions of arrears of contributions. So what the Law Commission hopes is that the revised scheme, taking on board its 121 recommendations for amendment, will be a preferred alternative to leasehold, and that people will actively choose to either convert or sign up to creating Commonhold schemes. However, the Law Commission has concluded that realistically it's not likely to take off unless either it becomes compulsory for new properties to be Commonhold, or there are adequate incentives put in place to make Commonhold a more attractive option to developers than leasehold. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. It's politically very popular, but there is a lot of status quo to get over before Commonhold becomes the norm, I suspect. So if getting rid of leasehold altogether isn't the option, the second solution is to make leasehold better and make it easier, cheaper and quicker to either enfranchise or acquire a lease extension. At the moment, the law on enfranchisement is horribly complicated, has been subject to endless amendments over the years, and has got itself into really rather a mess. So the Law Commission's task was to consider ways of simplifying the procedure, widening the scope of those who are entitled to enfranchise, and perhaps most importantly, presenting options for reducing the premium payable to enfranchise, while at the same time ensuring that sufficient compensation is payable to landlords. The consultation in relation to the enfranchisement reforms was published in September 2018, and again the final report came out at 1 minute past midnight today. The Law Commission divided its task into 4 fundamental questions. First of all, what should the enfranchisement rights be? Secondly, who should be entitled to exercise those rights? Thirdly, how should enfranchisement rights be exercised? And fourthly, of course, what should it cost? So going back to the first question, what should enfranchisement rights be? At the moment, there are different rules depending on whether you are a leaseholder of a flat or a leaseholder of a house. The procedure is different, the qualifying criteria are different, and what is intended is that the leaseholders of houses and flats should both have exactly the same rights. This will reduce the complexity and hopefully make the whole system cheaper and easier. A second fundamental change is that when applying for a lease extension, instead of getting a 50-year extension as you do in a house claim, or a 90-year extension as you do in a flat claim, the new extension will be 990 years. So a substantial change there. The first obvious advantage of that is that it means you don't have to do it again. One extension will be enough. And secondly, of course, it places the majority of the value of the property in the hands of the leaseholder and not in the hands of the freeholder. As before, the new lease would have a peppercorn ground rent. But there's also the proposal to have a new right whereby leaseholders of very long leases can just buy out the ground rent without needing to actually extend their lease. And again, this is to get over this problem of these escalating ground rents. Other changes would be that instead of the current system whereby you can only enfranchise the block that you live in, it should be possible to enfranchise multiple buildings in one claim. Quite often estates are set up with more than one building, and the service charges and what have you are divvied up on the basis that you're going to be contributing to the whole estate. So taking one block out of the equation creates all myriad of problems, which hopefully can be got over by this proposed reform. Another proposal which I think will help leaseholders is the suggestion that instead of the leaseholders having to see whether a landlord wants to take a lease back of units which are not let to leaseholders, the landlord can be required to take a lease back. That means, in effect, that the leaseholders don't need to actually purchase the reversion of that interest, and it should reduce the price. So, for example, if there are a lot of shops in the building which the leaseholders don't really want to acquire, they can require the landlord to take a lease back of those units and thereby reduce the premium payable. And similarly, the nominee purchaser can elect not to acquire an intermediate lease as part of the claim, and again, it's hoped that that will reduce the premium payable. There are a lot of other anomalies which it is proposed could be abolished. The most obvious one is, of course, the 2-year rule for lease extensions, which requires a tenant to have owned the flat for 2 years before they can make an extension claim. It also causes great problems when a leaseholder is in the process of selling the flat and has to sign the beneficence notice and all the rest of it, because otherwise the leaseholder won't have the right to do that for 2 years. So that's going to go. All the complicated financial criteria in the 1967 Act, whereby it all depends on what the rateable value was in 1965 and so on, that'll all go. The resident landlord exception will go, and the rule that if you own 3 or more flats, you don't qualify as a tenant for the purposes of enfranchisement will go. It's also proposed that the qualifying criteria will change. At the moment, the building doesn't qualify for enfranchisement if 25% or more of it is used for non-residential purposes. It is proposed that that limit should be increased to 50%. And similarly, if a tenant is acquiring the freehold of a house, up to 50% of it can be used for non-residential purposes. And it's proposed that the nominee purchaser must be a corporate body with limited liability. So all of those changes seem fairly obvious and sensible. So the next question that the Law Commission asked itself was how the enfranchisement rights should be exercised. As I'm sure most of us know, the current procedure is fraught with trip hazards, and it's intended that those trip hazards will be removed, and it'll be based slightly more on fairness. So first of all, I think I mentioned earlier, there could be a single procedure to apply to any enfranchisement claim. There will be the use of prescribed forms for making the claim and a prescribed form for making a response to the claim. So that should hopefully make the procedure cheaper and simpler. There will also be new rules on how the claim can be served and when it will be deemed served on the landlord, so that the landlord can't come back later and say, well, actually you didn't serve the sub intermediate landlord or whatever it was. If it's deemed served, then the landlord will be stuck with service. If there is no response from the landlord to the claim, then the right to just simply say, right, well, I'll have the lease extension or the freehold on the basis of what's in my notice goes, and instead it'll be necessary for the tenant or tenants to make an application to the tribunal, who will determine the terms, and they don't have to determine it on the basis of the notice. They can determine it on what they consider is appropriate. But on the other hand, the procedural traps which catch out the tenants will also be removed, with many of the automatic withdrawal provisions being abolished, so that again we don't have these traps that mean the claims come to an end because various time limits haven't been complied with. If the tenant sells his flat, then the claim notice will automatically transfer to the new owner, who can decide whether they want to proceed with an application or not. In relation to costs, it is suggested by the Law Commission that whether or not leaseholders should pay their landlord's non-litigation costs will depend to a certain extent on which method of valuation is adopted. If a market value option is adopted, the Law Commission says, well, normally in the marketplace, each party would pay its own costs, and there's no reason why the landlord should have its costs paid for by the tenant. However, if it's not going to be on a market value base, then it may be fair for the leaseholder to contribute towards the landlord's costs, but those costs should be capped at some sort of prescribed rate. In relation to litigation costs, the Commission is suggesting that all disputes should now be dealt with by the FTT, rather than having this ping-ponging between the county court and the tribunal, and that therefore the litigation costs should be dealt with under the tribunal's usual powers, which are in essence that it's a no-cost jurisdiction unless one party has behaved particularly unreasonably. And the fourth question, of course, was what should the price be? And that the report on the price actually came out in January this year, and the Commission's mission in relation to the price was slightly different to that which it had for the rest of enfranchisement, in that it was asked to present options for reducing the price rather than recommendations. And it came up with 3 options for reducing the price, which are on that slide, and I hope everybody can see them. They're rather small. There are 3 basic options and then 7 sub-options. And when the Commission was looking at the price, it was also looking at the sort of add-ons to the price. So, for example, the cost of arguing about the price, and the conveyancing costs and all those sort of things, and the time involved, which all adds to the general expense of the enfranchisement procedure. So it came up there with 3 possible ways of calculating the premium. So doing this on the basis of a lease extension, because obviously a collective is effectively on the same basis, but it's easy just to think of it as a lease extension. Scheme 3 is essentially the scheme that we have now. So the price for a lease extension would be compensation to the landlord for the loss of the rent for the remainder of the term, because for the rest of the term it's going to be a peppercorn, so that we call that the term. Then there's loss of the reversion based on the fact that the landlord will, instead of getting his capital value back in, say, 50 years' time, will have to wait 140 years' time. So that's called the reversion. But in addition, the leaseholder has to pay 50% of the marriage value, which recognises the fact that to the leaseholder, the the extended lease is worth more than the sum of the value of the short lease and the landlord's loss. And it's usually that marriage value which causes the most disputes, because it can, in the case of the short lease, be quite high. The shorter the lease, the higher the marriage value. So scheme 3 assumes that the leaseholder himself is in the market for buying the new lease, and that the leaseholder should therefore have to pay a percentage of the marriage value. At the other extreme, we have scheme 1, which is the value of the lease if it was sold to a third party and the leaseholder was not in the market. A third party would only be prepared to pay for the value of the term and the value of the reversion. Scheme 2 is a sort of hybrid between the two. It assumes that the leaseholder himself is not in the market to buy a lease extension at the moment, but that he may be in the market at some point in the future, and that therefore hope value should be paid, which is usually calculated as a percentage of the marriage value. And just to illustrate what difference it makes, I put on that slide there the effect on the price of a flat worth £250,000 with an unexpired term of 76 years and a ground rent of £50 rising to £200 over the term. And you can see that if marriage value is included, the price would be about £15,500, whereas if there is no marriage value or hope value, the premium would be just over £9,000. So it can have a significant impact on the premium payable. But the Law Commission didn't stop there. It had some other ideas of how the price could not necessarily be reduced, but could be made more certain, thereby reducing the cost of arguments and making the price a bit more predictable. The first suggestion was that all the various rates which are used by valuers to work out the value of the term and the value of the reversion and what have you could be prescribed. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect. Well, what rate do you prescribe them at? And if you prescribe them at one rate, they'll actually put the price up, and at another rate, they'll put the price down. But clearly, the idea of prescribing the rates would mean that there would be far smaller scope for arguing over the value of the price of a lease extension. The second sub-option relates to this problem of the onerous ground rents and the escalating and doubling ground rents, which can have a massive impact on the price paid for a lease extension or on a collective. And the idea here is that rather than using the actual ground rent, the ground rent for the purposes of calculating the premium should be capped at 0.1% of the freehold value of the property at the valuation date. Another element that can really whack up the price paid on a collective to acquire the freehold is development value. This is the value which the landlord says it's going to lose if it is required to compulsorily sell its interest to the leaseholders. The landlord will say, well, I had that large area of green over there, but I was going to put a skyscraper on. And by you acquiring it, I can no longer do that, and I need to be compensated for that loss. I had a case recently where the development value requested was 44 million because the landlord said he was going to put a big skyscraper in the front garden. It did go down rather significantly by the time we got to the tribunal, but as you can imagine, that's slightly off-putting to most leaseholders in that they realistically are not going to be able to raise millions of pounds to acquire the development value. So the possible solution to that problem is to say, well, okay, rather than actually paying development value, there could be a restriction placed on the title, and if the leaseholders decide at some subsequent date to do the development, then they'll have to buy off the restriction from the former landlord. And then 4 to 7, I don't want to go into those in any great detail. They were suggestions which the Commission put forward, which might make valuing either easier or fairer. Then, of course, there's the right to manage. Traditionally, the right to manage has been used where leaseholders can't afford to buy the freehold, or for whatever reason can't buy the freehold, but they want to take over the management of the residential parts of their block. Under the current legislation, the qualifying criteria are essentially the same as for a collective enfranchisement, and there are a lot of prescribed notices which leaseholders need to serve and which are very easy to get wrong. And there's been a lot of litigation over missing bits of prescribed forms and what have you. And the Law Commission has looked at this again and has tried to find ways of making the whole system simpler. One of the things it's noticed is that, in fact, there's no reason really why the right to manage should be restricted to flats. There's no logical reason why it can't also apply to houses. And similarly, the need for a self-contained building doesn't really apply with the right to manage, because you're not acquiring the building. The issue of flying freeholds doesn't arise. There's no reason why any part of the building couldn't be subject to the right to manage. So again, the consultation paper was published in January 2019, and the final report came out today. So some of the key proposals in relation to the right to manage are, again, that the qualifying criteria could be relaxed, although it is primarily aimed at residential leaseholders. There's no real reason why it couldn't apply to a building which has commercial space in it, bearing in mind that, of course, under the right to manage, you only take over the management of the residential parts anyway. So it's suggested that the qualifying criteria would be that buildings with up to 50% commercial space would qualify for the right to manage. Again, as with the collective enfranchisement, it is suggested that there could be a right to manage more than one building, because often estates are run as a single unit and have joint driveways and forecourts and gyms and all the rest of it. And the RTM could make an application to acquire the right to manage for the whole estate. And it is also proposed that the number of notices leaseholders need to serve and give can be reduced, and that the tribunal can have the power to waive procedural mistakes in those claim notices. Another matter that the Commission thought would be worth amending is the problem of management of property which is not exclusive to the premises which the RTM is claiming the right to manage. This is addressing the gala unity problem, where, for example, you have a shared garden or car park, which under the current rules, the RTM can acquire the right to manage, even though there are other blocks on the estate who are also required to manage it under their own regimes. And the recommendations are designed to ensure that either the parties or the tribunal will have to set out how the dual management is to be carried out, and and if appropriate, how the RTM is going to carry out those management functions in tandem with whoever else it is that's obliged to manage them. It's also suggested that the requirement that the leaseholders should pay the landlord's costs of an RTM claim should be removed, and that the leaseholder should have a right to request information about premises at an early stage of the process, so that they know what they're getting into. Another suggestion, which I haven't put on the slide, is that there should be more education available to leaseholders as to what's involved in the right to manage. So in addition to the proposals from the Law Commission, the government has also put out a number of press releases in relation to tackling exploitative practices in the leasehold sector, and it's hoped that these will play into the 3 reports which I've just talked about. One of the government press releases said that they are intending to ban the sale of any further leasehold houses. Houses will have to be sold on a freehold basis unless therefore on a lease for less than 21 years. So in the long run, that should eliminate the need to ask for lease extensions of houses, or for the 1967 type Act right to buy the freehold of a house. Of course, if Commonhold becomes compulsory for new blocks, then the need for collective enfranchisement and lease extensions would also become redundant over time. In addition to banning leasehold houses, the government has also announced that it's going to ban ground rent for all future residential leases of both houses and flats. And again, this will have a knock-on effect on the price of a lease extension or a collective enfranchisement, because there will be no need to compensate the landlord for the loss of rent. Similarly, if leases of enough leases become extended by 990 years, I should say, the cost of collectively enfranchising should also be significantly reduced, because the freehold will already be subject to 990 year leases at a peppercorn rent, which means that the term and reversion will be relatively minimal, and of course there wouldn't be any marriage value under the current rules anyway. So it's hoped that all these proposals dovetail in together and should create a system where leaseholders are more in control. The cost of acquiring lease extensions and enfranchising should be reduced, and even if Commonhold isn't adopted, hopefully leaseholders will have the next best thing, being long leases at peppercorn rents and being allowed to control the buildings in which their valuable assets are situated. So a lot of work has been done, but what has actually changed so far? Well, nothing yet. But watch this space, because there is a lot of reform in the air, and hopefully things will get better for leaseholders. Now, I believe that there is a method of asking questions on the system. So if anybody has any questions, I will do my best to, oh, there's lots of questions, to answer them. Let me just have a quick look and see what we've got there. I've got lots of questions saying they can hear me, which is reassuring. So one person has asked me whether I'll send out the slides to this event, which I think the answer is they are available from our marketing department. I think the talk has also been recorded, so if anybody wants to put themselves through it again, it is available for a second go. Somebody's asked me what my best guess is as to when any draft legislation may be prepared, to which the answer is I have absolutely no idea. I know it is a priority, but on the other hand, we've now got a world pandemic to deal with, so I think a lot of things have probably gone on hold. But there may be other people in my chambers who know more about that than I do. I think most of the other questions are of sort of specific interest, and perhaps I should have to deal with them by email at some point. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. I hope it's been interesting and given you some idea of what's going on, and whetted your appetite to go home and now read 1,882 pages of Law Commission reports. Thank you very much. Goodbye.